I did the hour-long legal thing before. Some of you are here for that. And basically, when you're occupying space, the law tends to become less and less relevant in reality. And what actually becomes more relevant are the power dynamics and the politics that are going on around you, and also the social dynamics around you. And so it's really important to have, at least in my experience, have from beginning to end, when you occupy a building, a property, a garden, that you have done research and that you enter the property in a way that is the most, gives you the most protection, and that you hold on to the property in a way that gives you the most legitimacy and most support in the community. And so that's what I'm going to talk about right now. The first thing that I think is really important that most squatters and a lot of people in general overlook is doing research. And I passed around a flyer earlier, and I still have that flyer here, that if someone wants to pass it around, feel free. But on the back of that flyer, from the legal side, oh, let me have one just so I can refer to it. Thanks. So on the one side, I had basically all the code sections that we discussed earlier, that basically most of the laws pertaining to squatting, occupancy, adverse possession, trespass, and criminal and civil trespass. But on the other side, it's basically a step-by-step of all the places where you can actually research properties. And so that to me is a really important step, because what a lot of people do is they see a building or they see a lot and they say, oh, that's empty, this would be perfect for X, Y, Z. And in my experience, fixating on a location or a specific space is really not a good idea. And the best thing for you to do, in my experience, now a lot of people succeed despite all the odds. You know, some people do everything backwards from my perspective, but the thing that I always recommend is that going house by house, block by block, in an area, a general area that you want to do an occupation in, and identify every address of every vacant property in that space. And don't think, okay, I want a residential property. Don't think I want a garden, and don't think, oh, I want a warehouse. Focus on every opportunity that you see vacant, and make a list, because even if you don't want to use that space, you could provide that information to someone else in the movement who wants to do a project. So if you want to do a garden and you find a warehouse, maybe someone else is working on occupying a community center or a social center. So notate all the vacant abandoned properties, house by house, block by block, lot by lot. And I usually go in a grid, you know, east to west, then north and south in a grid, or vice versa. And so that is the best way to identify a property. There are other ways to identify vacant properties. Like on the sheet here, you can look at list of foreclosed properties. There's websites here on this piece of paper that should be going around. SF Gate, SF Chronicle has a list. And also you can get it directly from the recorder's office, because every time there is a foreclosure, there's a notice of default filed with the recorder's office. And so you can go online and see all the notices of default, and it's overwhelming how many notices of default there are. And a notice of default has to be associated with a deed of trust. The deed of trust is the mechanism in which a trustee is the referee between the bank and the person who borrowed money. And that trustee decides, okay, we're going to foreclose, or oh no, this isn't, the banks doesn't have, the right to foreclose, so they decide. And so you can find all that information through the recorder's office, and if you want, and otherwise going block by block and just researching site by site. The first thing I do after I get a list of 20 abandoned properties, ideally, is then I go down to the assessor, the Alameda County Tax Assessor's office, which their office is at 1221 Oak Street. You just basically go down 13th, and it's the administration building on the right, about 2 blocks before you hit the water. And you just go up to the second floor, and you start putting in addresses of properties, and it'll show you who owns those properties and what their mailing address is. The only place you can get that information is physically at the assessor's office records department in room 245 of that building. They do not make that information available online. You can get some information online, like the parcel number, but you can't get the owner's name, you can't get the address, and we'll take questions, I think, after, unless you have. Yeah, you can call them. Basically, you can call them and request a property owner's name and address. You can also write them a letter and request a property owner's name and address, but they'll only give you a certain number of, they'll only answer a certain number of those requests. And so if you have 20 properties, you really need to go down there physically and do it yourself with their computers. And when you look at that, the initial thing you'll see are, you'll get some information. There are some red flags, there's some green flags, there's some yellow flags. As far as red flags are concerned, if the property has recently been bought, so which means that, you know, the house has been abandoned, but then someone just bought it, and so they're probably going to do something with it, and you know, it's not necessarily determinative. So. Well, anyway, I thought I had all this listed down. Oh yeah, now I remember where I wrote this. I wrote this on my blog. So I should mention that I have a blog that has all this information available. So if you guys want to refer back to that, it's blogsquats.blogspot.com. But you know, you can get some information though at the assessor's records department. If it's been recently bought, it's probably no-go. But if it hasn't been, there hasn't been a transfer of title in 10, 20 years and it's abandoned, it's probably just really abandoned. One of the biggest green flags you'll ever see is if in a completely derelict building, you find that the owner's name and, the owner's address is that building. So if the owner's claiming, you know, it says in their records that the owner lives in a building that's completely uninhabitable, then clearly that right there is a green flag that it's an abandoned building and there's no way to contact the owner. And that's usually, you know, we have a community or a collective garden that we do, and that's what they're going to talk about at half past the hour. But yeah, the address of the owner was the empty lot. So obviously there was no one living in an empty lot with that full of weeds, so we just made a collective garden there. So yeah, so the assessor gives you the parcel number, the owner's name, owner's address. And the next thing I usually do is check to see if there's any unpaid back taxes. That is, that information is available online on the website, on the piece of paper going around. But usually when I find that information out, you're already in the tax assessor's office and the tax collector's office is in the same building, so I just check it from their computers right there. Then what we've been doing is going in the basement of the assessor collector's office, and there's a tunnel that leads to the courthouse. It's actually really surreal. And you come up and you can go into the clerk of the court's office and then research the owner's name, find out any litigation, and if there is a judicial foreclosure proceeding, that will come up in the research right there. California, though, is not a judicial foreclosure state, so most foreclosures never go through the court systems. They go through the trustee process. The trustee decides, the trustee sells it, and so you have to go to the recorder's office anyways. But you can find out a lot of information. You can find out if the owner has an estate that's pending, if they died, and there's heirs that are going to, you know, get the property, and know if that's pending and know how long that's pending. So if you see a probate case that was filed 2 weeks prior to doing the research, most likely the heirs of the estate are going to come forward and you're going to have to deal with them, and it's probably not a good idea to go into that property. But if you see an estate that was filed 10, 20 years ago and no one's come forward to claim the property or the estate, then it's pretty clear that that person died without any heirs. The most ideal property is one where the owner died, had no family. Sometimes owners just completely wash their hands of a property and just walk away for whatever their reasons are. They're unpaid. They didn't want to pay the back taxes or whatever. So the next thing I do in research is go to the recorder's office, where you can find where the grant deed is, and if there's a foreclosure proceeding, you look for a notice of default, and if that notice of default is associated with a deed of trust, bam, there's a foreclosure. So that's how you find out if there's foreclosures. You can do the process in reverse. Just look up notices of default on any given day, any range of days, and you'll see thousands of foreclosures. It almost seems like in Oakland right now, you could play pin the tail on the donkey on a map of Oakland, and you're going to hit a foreclosure. So, it's pretty overwhelming how many foreclosures are happening right now. So you've identified the property, you've done the research, you find out the owner is nowhere to be found, so you decide this spot is viable. And I always say, go with what is viable, don't go with what is your ideal spot. Like, oh, I like this house, it's really nice, and it's got my favorite kind of blinds and my favorite kind of color paint or whatever. The hedges are cool, whatever. Go with what's viable. Okay, there's a tree growing into the roof of the house and there's fire damage, but there's no owner, and I'm gonna have to work on this house, and it's gonna be really difficult. That's how I would describe my house, and I've been in possession of that house for 10 years. So go with what's viable. It might not be in the short term, the ideal situation, but if you're thinking long term and you want to defend the space that you're occupying, go with what's viable. Go with the property that no one cares about, nobody wants, and has just been left to the historic record to be to disappear. So then you enter the property, and obviously entering the property has its its particular things that you have to deal with, which is going to be dealt with, which was dealt with a little bit earlier. And when entering the property, it's really important, as far as I'm concerned, to look the part and be normal. Aside from be normal. Don't be weird. The first thing, when you enter a property, a lot of people think about, okay, I'm gonna paint this is my room, and you start bringing furniture and you start, painting your room and putting up posters. But the most important thing is making good with your neighbors, having good relationships. And the best way to have good relationship with your neighbors is to, make the property look nice. You're going into a derelict property, it's got boards on the windows, the paint's peeling off, there's trash in the yard, and the yard's overgrown. Pick up the trash, cut down the weeds, do some landscaping maybe, put a fresh coat of paint on the house, pull off all the boards, make it look nice. Then all the neighbors love you. They're not going to call the cops, they're not going to call the code inspectors. Make sure that if the plumbing is not working, that is the first thing you fix on the inside, because not to get too in-depth with that, but if you don't have functioning toilets in your space, that is something that's going to piss off your neighbors, especially if they see, if you're lucky, if the sewage lines work, you're still going to be pushing carts full of barrels of water in and out of the house to bucket flush. And people, it's weird, and neighbors don't like that. They don't like that kind of vibe, whatever you feel about it. So my first order of business is making sure that I can flush toilets and wash my hands and wash my dishes and, be, somewhat respectable in the neighborhood. So that to me are some of the most important things as far as your physical presence in the space. Earlier we talked about other kinds of things you can do to protect yourself: filing a homestead declaration, which is on that piece of paper that's going around, filing a notice of intent to preserve interest, which is on that piece of paper that's going around, and in some instances filing a quitclaim deed to somebody. If you have multiple people entering the property and setting it up, and only some of those people intend to stay there, have the people that are leaving file quitclaim deeds to those people, so that there's a deed on file that says that somebody has acknowledged that you have an interest in that property, and file all that stuff with the recorder's office, and so you have the air of legitimacy. So of course that's not going to necessarily stop anything, because really at the end of the day, like I said, the legalities of everything are less important than the politics and the power dynamics that we're surrounded by. And so the strategies that we use, you can't just cite code sections when cops are, kicking in your door. They don't really respond very well to that. Not often, at least in my experience. So having the support of your neighbors and figuring out strategies for avoiding that situation, avoiding the police coming and saying, oh, you're trespassing, blah, 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 get out of here. One of the biggest ways I've found to avoid being criminalized in a building is to play the part. It's culture jamming, perhaps, is one way of putting it, because a lot of squatters have this sense of themselves as lacking entitlement. It's like, you sneak in at night and you feel like you don't deserve a home. Well, forget about that. Everybody deserves a home, and the house that you're occupying is your own. And you have to get that in your head. Convince yourself of your right to be there, and then act accordingly. When the police show up, there's a lot of things you can do. Sometimes, and these are the things I would recommend not doing, running away, barricading yourself in the house. What are some other things that I would not recommend doing? Just pretending, hiding or something. The best way to deal with the police when you're occupying a building is to act like they work for you. Act like you're the boss, you're in charge, and the phrase I love to use is there something I can help you with? It's magic. It's like, these aren't the droids you're looking for. Is there something I can help you with, officer? It's like, well, yes, we had a call that there was some trespassers at this property. Well, officer, I've been here all day. I haven't seen anybody. And it's like, well, what are you doing here? Like, well, I'm mowing the lawn. Is there something I can help you with? And, it's like, magic. So it's, don't, I'd recommend, look like when you're entering the building, wear some coveralls, have tools and look, do things in broad daylight. Don't, and if you go in, if you go in the middle of the night and you have a crowbar and you're smashing a window, or you throw a rock through a window and you're like, ah, and then run in there and then try to occupy the building, and then the cop shows up and you say at 2 in the morning, is there something I can help you with? And that's not gonna, fly. But if you're, if you're doing it in broad daylight and you're sitting there, changing the locks on the building, and somebody shows up, in our house, we were doing it in broad daylight, and someone said, hey, what are you doing? And they said, well, we're fixing the door. And they're like, oh. It's like, do you need any help? And so some locksmiths came in and helped us fix our door. So now we have storm doors. So I mean, just be entitled and be, like, oh, I belong here. Yeah. Oh, it's okay. If you guys are getting bored with me, guerrilla gardening, go. Okay, so I'm going to continue though. So the biggest thing that you're going to face when occupying a building, the biggest test usually is some kind of confrontation with the government. If you can pass that confrontation with the government, everything else is really easy. So the police came and you painted the house, the neighbors love you, you have functioning water, ideally you have a phone and electricity, and you've set up all these utility service, you have, you know, Wi-Fi maybe if you're, you know, if you can afford it. And, you know, you're sitting there and in your lawn chairs, and you've done all this landscaping, and, you know, the cops come by and they say, is there something, you say, is there something I can help you with? And they're like, well, heard somebody lives in this house. And then you say, yeah, it's me. Another way to avoid the police thing is to say, I work here, you know, and, you know, you can do that. When we were entering the property that I was at and we were doing the doors, I was really busy with litigation on another property, so I wasn't at the property, so everyone said they worked for me, which they technically did because I cracked it and originally. So when they came back to fix the door, my friends, you know, they were fixing the doors on my house and they were basically working for me, work trade. So, and we wrote up work trade agreements, so we all had contracts, and so they could be property managers. And they're like, well, we're the property managers, and oh, thanks. We're the property managers, we work for Steve DiCaprio, and we're fixing the door, and blah, blah, blah. And so the police left, and we didn't see them anymore. So you might think that that's the last thing you're gonna see happen. And historically in Oakland, which is changing, the police don't really give a shit about this kind of stuff. You know, they care about, someone's, you know, they don't really respond very well to 911 calls in the first place, so petty trespassing is not really high on their priority list. And that's different in Berkeley. In Berkeley, they have a whole department designed to go after people, which is something I found out, unfortunately. So the thing in Oakland that happens, though, is you have the Community Economic Development Agency, which is right around there. It's you know, and there's all these inspectors that, you know, just love to put blight fines on properties, and they love to go in and say, oh, this isn't up to code, you can't do this. And so the most common problem most occupiers have in Oakland that are occupying buildings is the Community Economic Development Agency and their inspectors, which, by the way, a grand jury recently found out were harassing poor people throughout Oakland and were corrupt, and so now they're having to justify themselves at this point. So I was really glad to hear that. So yeah, so the city inspectors are the next people to come, and they might figure something out, and then they might bring the cops later. But in my case, I just brought the building up to code as best I could, and we just yelled at each other for about a year, and then they gave up. So then at that point, you know, it's a matter of if you have a confrontation with the owner, and if you did all the research in the beginning, you should never have a confrontation with the owner, because you should know that the owner is not there unless you decide to have that confrontation. If you know the owner's there, or he's around, or she's around, or there's somebody around that's going to, you know, claim the property, I always recommend sending a certified letter to that person before you do anything. A certified letter saying, may I occupy your building? You know, because you don't want to enter a building and then have the property owner on the steps with the police on one side and the property inspectors on the other. It's just not worth it. And it's better to engage that person right away. You know, who knows? You might say, oh, I'm with Occupy, we're doing this thing. And they might think that that's really awesome, and then just let you use the building. There's been a number of occupations that were permissive, and the property owner said, well, I'm not doing anything with this property, so as long as you don't mess it up and you know, don't cause any trouble, then this is fine. So send a certified letter so you have proof, because I have talked to somebody who said they sent a letter to an owner asking if they could occupy a building. The owner did not respond, and then they occupied the building. And then when the police showed up with the owner, he said, well, I sent this guy a letter. And then the police said, did you get that letter? And the guy said, yeah, I got the letter, but I didn't respond. And then the police said, well, this is between you guys, and left. So I send certified letters so that, and you make a copy. It's like, can I occupy your building? This would be really awesome. We could make a garden or blah, blah, blah. Or we're creating a medic space or whatever. And just lay it out. And, you know, then I like to send a second letter saying, hey, you didn't respond to my letter. We're going to occupy your building, you know, adverse possession, you know, and, you know, make it, you know, so that if they don't respond to the second letter, that it's clear you're going to occupy their building. And it's better, you know, a lot of people that are occupying properties kind of, you know, dance around the ownership issue. They, you know, oh, I think the owner lives here, and they like go up to the door and they go knock, 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 and then they run away. And, you know, it's better to kick the hornet's nest before you're all in it. I can tell you that right now. So, yeah, just engage the owner as best you can, send certified letters, try to figure things out, and then maybe they'll let you do it. If they don't, then you can occupy it and you have certified letters showing that they did not give a shit leading up to the beginning, and it's much less likely you'll get convicted of trespassing at that point. And then, yeah, that's, you know, pretty much the way I go about it. It's important to do research. The next thing is when you enter the property, to enter it in the most legitimate possible way, having contacted the owner, having filed paperwork, having gotten utilities, having made yourself, you know, one of the best neighbors you can. And then if you ever have any confrontation with the government, be it police, be it city inspectors, to act like you're supposed to be there and really own the space, own your situation. Be the person that's in charge, be the person that owns that house. Civil Code Section 1006, which I love to cite all the time, says if you occupy it, you own it. So be the owner, you know? So, and that goes a long way, because city inspectors, if you come at them and say, no, I have rights, and the city inspector, you know, all they have are code violations. So all they can say is bring it up to code at that point. So yeah, so, you know, bring it up to code. You know, we keep our trash cans behind the front of the house, and we pick up all the trash and make sure that the weeds are only so high. And if you want to build a shack, it has to be 120 square feet or less. Otherwise, it's a code violation. But you can build a shack, which they might be talking about in the guerrilla gardening. So, you know, maybe we should build 120 square foot shacks on every empty lot in Oakland, and that's how we can house people. And it's up to code, so they can't do anything. Questions, would be cool if people lined up here so we could hear the questions, or we could go make sandwiches. Any questions? And I do have more of these things about research in the law if you're interested, these flyers.
I got here a little late, so I'm sorry if I missed this, but you talked about fixing up the plumbing. So do you just call up the utility companies, you call up East Bay Mud and you say, turn on my water? Or how do you, et cetera, with the other utilities?
Yeah, East Bay Mud, you just call them up and say, turn on the water. And the same goes for the phone company, the same goes for Comcast if you want to get cable or something. The only, I'm trying to think about this, what service? Electrical is the same thing. I've had a problem with my electrical because the house was so abandoned that they have no record of electricity ever existing on the property. So then I had to get a permit to show that electricity was up to code, and then the city refused to inspect the property because they refused to acknowledge that I own the property. And we're at a detente right now, so I don't have electricity. So we're putting in solar panels, go off grid. But pretty much all the utilities you can get in your name. You don't have to prove ownership. The trash service is interesting because the trash is the only thing you need to prove you're the owner. Or not even prove, but you have to say you're the owner. And, you know, we have trash service. I told, you know, somebody called them and said, oh, I'm the property manager working for Steve DiCaprio, and we got trash service, but they're not sending us a bill. And I guess they're sending a bill to a P.O. box that's getting returned to them. And so, and then, you know, I have to pay the trash plus penalties at the end of the year on the property taxes, which is pretty annoying. But so trash is the only service that you have to have, you know, technically the owner consent, but they don't ask you for like a deed or anything. So you could still just call them up and say, yeah, I own the house, and turn it on. The problems, though, that we come up with water is that sometimes in a property that's been abandoned for a really long period of time, the water meter isn't there anymore, or you know, and it just disappears after a period of time. I don't know if someone scraps it or if East Bay Mud takes it, but you'll come into situations where there won't be any water service, and you'll have to get East Bay Mud to come out and all that, but they turn it on, and you might have to, if you haven't had electrical service or if you hadn't had water service, and basically they're commencing new service on a property that in their records doesn't exist, if it's a property that's been abandoned for like 20, 30, 40 years, sometimes you have to pay more money to get it turned on, and sometimes it's like a pain in the ass. Did you have a question, or are you just hanging out?
What about properties that are not residential to begin with, like old shops or out-of-business banks or police stations or things like that? Are the procedures different? Are the codes different? Are they squattable?
Yeah, different properties. I would not recommend squatting a police station because, and this is something I didn't mention, but squatters' rights don't really work. You know, Civil Code 1000, Section 1006 and all that stuff, adverse possession. You can't adversely possess against the government, and unless it's a private police force, that's like maybe Halliburton's police or something, you could, you know, occupy their building and take it from them if they don't show up for 5 years technically, but not the city, you know, not OPD or anybody. And when you're occupying a building, it doesn't really matter for property law purposes, like for adverse possession, like we were talking about earlier. It doesn't really matter what you do with the property so much as that you're there. And that's because that's based on state law. Now the local law is what, you know, state law doesn't differentiate between property. It's local ordinance that says this is zoned as a commercial, this is zoned as a residential, et cetera, et cetera. And so those guys around the corner in the CETA office, they're the ones that are going to be hassling you if you use a business property for residential purposes or something like that. But it's, like I said, it's not really the legality of it, it's more the situation. If nobody's paying attention and nobody cares, and you're using a commercial property for residential purposes, then it doesn't matter. But you could be totally using a building for the purposes that they're intended, and if you're in a neighborhood where all the neighbors hate you because you're poor, you know, like if you're up in the hills or something and you're you know, I don't know if any of you have watched any of these reports about people occupying McMansions, but there's a lot of these McMansions that were built, like tract house mansions, and people are occupying them around the country. And that is the most hostile neighborhood you could ever be in, is to show up and occupy a McMansion next to people who are underwater on their McMansions, because, you know, they're not going to have solidarity with you because, you know, they don't identify as working class people, or, you know, if they are working class people, they don't want to be. You have a question?
Yeah, I got here late also, so I didn't get your earlier talks. But as far as property taxes and anything else like insurance or anything like that, or is insurance just something the banks require?
I do not have insurance on my occupation, on my squat, on my reclaimed space, as whatever the nomenclature is today. I don't know. I guess it's reclaimed space. Yeah, usually insurance is required when you purchase a house because you have a mortgage and the equity is at stake, and so the bank requires you to get insurance. But you could, if you voluntarily want to get insurance, I guess you could insure something. The property taxes, you know, this is actually, property taxes is something I didn't cover very much, just as a kind of strategic purpose, because, which is good, I'm glad you brought that up. Basically, you're required, if you want to own a house by adverse possession, you're required during the time you're there to pay the property taxes. technically, there is case law that says that if you do not pay the taxes while you're there, but occupy it for 5 years and the taxes go unpaid, you can then pay them back through a certificate of redemption. The problem with doing that is if you have 10 years back taxes when you enter a property and then you don't pay the property taxes as you go, then it's all going to be added together and you're going to have to pay 10 years prior to when you entered it. Plus, there might be a tax foreclosure. The garden that we're occupying right now has been in tax foreclosure since before we occupied it. The thing about it is that it has more taxes levied against the property than the property is worth. So they auction it off like once a year, and then no one buys it because it's, you know, $300,000 for a little piece of land. So in that case, you know, what can you do? You're paying penalties on the interest of hundreds of thousands of dollars of back taxes, and so it's not even worth it. And so it's kind of like you reach an impasse. So one school of thought is to pay each year's property taxes before they get added to the compounded taxes. But then if you have huge penalties, that's a lot of money. The other thing is to, as I said, there is the Revenue and Taxation Code, Section 610, which says that you can request for adverse possession purposes to have your name added to the assessor's roll. And the assessor's office is supposed to add your name and then assess the property in your name as well as the previous owner. So there's two sets of owners pending the adverse possession. Like I said before, in the previous session that we did, Alameda County doesn't do that. They, you know, flaunt the law, and you'll realize that a lot of city, county, state agencies don't follow the law, even if you present it to them. I'm sure some of you have been confronted with a police officer who was saying, "Oh, you're going to go to jail," and then you said, "Well, the law's here." I know you were telling me about a story where you're like, "The law is written on this sign right here. It says, you know, you can read the sign over here," and you know, does the cop care at that point? No, you're the wrong type of person to be in this space right now. You're going to jail. So there is the theoretical concept, and this is yet to be tested. If you ask the assessor to assess the property in your name based on the law that they're required to follow, and they refuse to do that, does that mean that you have a zero assessment at that point? Because if there is no assessment on property that you're adversely possessing, you're not required to pay taxes. So I don't know, but ideally, and this is luckily the situation I was in, I lucked out, and really it's trial and error, and a lot of it is chance, and so you have to be persistent. You have to keep cracking buildings and see what happens, and keep researching and keep going. But when I occupied the building, that was the year the administrator of the estate of the guy who died 20 years before, that was the year he just died. So we entered the property and he died, and then the taxes stopped getting paid. So the minute I entered the property was the first year that the taxes stopped getting paid. So I was lucky I didn't have to pay any extra taxes than what I was there for. So.
Hi, I just wanted to talk really briefly about a strategy we used in 2003 when we squatted a space as a convergent space and as a place for people to come who are protesting the war to come and sleep and eat for a few nights. We worked for months figuring out an appropriate building, and were able to house and feed people and flyer people during the protests. And there were a lot of people coming from out of town. And it was pretty spectacular, but we had decided as a group ahead of time, just because of that particular situation, that when and if the cops came, that we were going to voluntarily clear out, mostly because we didn't want to spend our time trying to hold down a building when the cops were on, full, what do you call it, paranoia. And we were able to, when the cops finally did come, we had coordinated ahead of time to have a person who was going to go and liaison with the cops and keep them settled down while other people went through it. This was a 5-floor building, and got people to round up their stuff and exit together as a group. There were kids who were underage in the building who were really nervous about being around the cops and being picked up as runaways. And we were able to talk to them to be like, stick with us, we're all walking out together. And that way we were able to leave successfully and be back in the streets, you know, within a half hour, and stay there protesting in the streets, which is, at that time, was our goal.
Thank you. That does remind me that what she's bringing up is important, that there's a point where you have to determine when you stop fighting for a property and what lengths you're going to go to. You know, obviously the ideal scenario is that you evade and avoid any kind of confrontation, you know, rather than bringing confrontation upon yourself. But often you can't avoid that. Often the police come and you could say, is there something I can help you with, officer? And you could say all that stuff. And I know people have done that. Some people that are here have gone through that and have fought the good fight of, you know, putting on, getting good with the neighbors, you know, doing right by the property, fixing it up, and setting up themselves to seem like the people that are supposed to be there. And then and it's just the city decided, you know, never mind. And something I realize is that once the authorities decide that you do not have legitimate possession of that property and they are going to remove you, then it's really difficult to change that dynamic. You know, you could cite Civil Code Section 1006, you can cite penal codes, you can cite this, that, the other, but once the police and city or county officials decide that you're out, they're going to keep doing that unless there is a complete and utter groundswell of support, such as People's Park or something of that nature. There would have to be some groundswell of political support for your occupation at that point. I'm not saying it's not doable, but in my experience, if you're doing something low-key for the purposes of doing a project or doing housing or doing a garden, once those authorities are really bearing down on you and they're really focused on removing you from the project, you know, they could arrest you and then you could like come back and they're just going to arrest you again. And I know this because I was, you know, I did this in Berkeley and I was arrested. I was cited 6 times and the cops removed me from the property 6 times. And I was just like, this is illegal. This is abandoned property, Civil Code Section 1006. Well, they just kept coming back and then it just turned bad. So like she said, it's probably good to know when to move on to another spot if things do go sour. And you know, if you are confronted with the police and they are going to arrest you, as far as I know, they always give you an opportunity to opt out. You know, if the police show up and they're kicking down your door and everything you say to them, they won't listen, they're going to ask you to leave because you have to, you know, they can't prosecute you if you thought the house was abandoned. You know, and so when the police come the first time, they inform you that, oh, this property is owned by so-and-so and he doesn't want you here. And then you are on notice. But they can't arrest you then because up to that point, you had no idea that that was the situation. So when you go back, that's when you get arrested. So usually you have time to opt out, and usually it's a good idea to determine how much you want to risk for a particular spot and what kind of statement you're trying to make. So I think that's all the questions, right? So we can all,
So when there's an auction of the house, what's the best strategy to, you show up at the auction and say, hey, I live in this place, or this house is unlivable, or what do you do?
Well, I've only been involved in one auction. That was Hilarity, which a lot of people know about. And I don't know the best strategy, but I know what our strategy was, which kind of worked. Like Just Cause was mentioning, there's lots of points in the process of a foreclosure. So, you know, and what's happening is a lot of people are occupying buildings that are abandoned and then foreclosed. So you not only have owners that are getting foreclosed on, and you not only have tenants that are getting foreclosed on, but you also have squatters, occupiers who are now getting foreclosed on. So we're all fighting the banks, we're all fighting foreclosure, and it's kind of crazy that all these different people who are coming at, housing access from different perspectives are now all in the same boat, fighting Bank of America, fighting Wells Fargo. What we did, and you can, and I think this is, a pretty decent strategy, is to go to the auctions. And, if you could engage, we engaged a nonprofit and said, or a co-op, and said, hey, could you buy our house so we could, so we could keep our house and we could work together. And no, we got some people that wanted to, raise money to buy the house at auction. And we tried that, but before we actually tried that, we actually confronted the people in the auction, and we went down to the, they sell it's really bizarre. They do these auctions at the courthouse steps, at the Renee C. Davidson courthouse, which is at the end of 13th and 12th, facing the ocean, facing the lake. And it's like a really beautiful spot, and there's these courthouse steps, and it looks, it looks like, some kind of retro, kind of situation. And there's just all these like random people standing around on the courthouse steps, like kind of like we are, except a little more anxious and more well dressed, and they're all just, I want to buy that house really cheap. And it's just really, it's almost like, when it gets going, it's almost like all these speculators like picking the bones of Oakland, and just like, it's really weird, and it's really weird they're just doing it out in the open, and just, and what we did, which, what I was thinking about would be a good strategy in general, like maybe go to every single auction, was we got, a marching band, and we got a bunch of people, and we just did a huge protest. I drank half a bottle of Jägermeister and with a friend, and we split a bottle of Jägermeister, and we just like started wandering around amongst the people because it's just out in the open. We were like, don't buy our house. They're like, you're chilling an auction, you're chilling stuff. And we just kind of started arguing with people, and then and the thing is that it's actually helpful for the speculators, because if you're going to do that, the speculators want to know. One of the speculators actually hired just a few thugs to come in and like start smashing up the house and say, get out. And then we went and we were like, no, we're not getting out. And so that guy didn't bid on the house because he figured, okay, I can't muscle these people out of the house. And then we showed up in the steps. He's like, and they're going to do math. They're going to be like, okay, the thugs cost $1,000 and the asking price is X, and they're going to calculate their thugs. And they're like, oh, the thugs didn't work, so I'm going to have to go through an eviction process, la la la. So, they're gonna factor all that in, and they're gonna say, oh, there's like 100 people here defending this house at this auction, so I'm gonna have to deal with that. And so they're crunching the numbers. They're thinking about their lawyer bill and their liability and all the and so it's just gonna be difficult for that house to actually get auctioned off at that point. And so, but if it's a foreclosure, if they don't auction off the property, it reverts back to the bank. So then you're dealing with the bank at that point. So are you dealing with the bank? Are you dealing with a speculator? I don't know which is better. I'd rather fight a bank personally at this point, just because there's this huge abstract monolithic creature that probably doesn't, that's sitting on tons of housing stock. So they're probably going to, because the banks are sending out all these notices, 3-day notice to pay rent or quit. And so people are just clearing out of their houses. So they'd probably want to just deal with the easy people to get rid of. And if we just make it harder and harder for the banks, that'd be a good strategy. So are we done? Any other questions? All right, cool. You could catch the tail end of the guerrilla gardening over there, maybe. And I have more flyers that show you where to do all the research, and also what the laws are on occupancy and property law. And tomorrow at noon and Friday at noon, I'm going to meet people by the flagpole, and we're all going to walk down to the recorder's office, whoever shows up, and I'll walk you through the entire research process, from the assessor's records department to the tax collector's department to the courthouse to the recorder's office. We'll go through all the records. So find yourself a list of properties that you're that are empty or vacant, abandoned, 10 or 20, I recommend. Meet me tomorrow at noon or Friday at noon, and I'll go down there with you and we'll look it all up. Thanks. Huh? Oh, well, yeah, noon tomorrow and Friday noon, right by the flagpole over here. And we're going to walk down 13th Street and go down to the county administration building and do research together. And we're going to, hopefully, my idea is that we learn how to do research together, and then I'll show you how I do it, and then you can show other people, and then suddenly all these county offices will be full of Occupy people researching properties and scheming and coming up with ideas, and we'll just occupy the entire city, and the banks will never take Oakland from us. So that's, that's kind of, overarching thought on that, and I'll leave you with that to mull over.